The sound didn't come like thunder.
It came like a dry snap.
Short. Surprising.
Before the smoke, there was silence. And before the silence, curiosity.
Long before modern battlefields.
Humans were already testing the idea of containing fire within an enclosure.
Not for illumination, not for warmth,
but to break through.
The history of the grenade begins far from the word grenade itself.
It begins with fragile containers, earthen,
made of simple ceramic, sometimes made of thick glass.
At first, there was no standard.
There was no single name. There were attempts.
Records from the past show that, during the Song dynasty in China, there were descriptions of objects thrown by hand, filled with primitive gunpowder.
They were not sophisticated weapons.
They were dangerous experiments.
Gunpowder was still unstable, mixed with error, feared, uncertain.
To many people's surprise, these containers did not always explode when intended.
Sometimes sooner, sometimes later, sometimes never.
But when they did work, the impact was psychological before it was physical. A small object,
a short arc through the air, and then the shock. The soldiers didn't know what they had heard. They didn't know where it came from, and that mattered. Fear always travels faster than shrapnel. Meanwhile, in the Mediterranean world, the Byzantine Empire was developing its own incendiary weapons,
flammable mixtures, substances that burned even on water. Some of these compounds were placed in sealed containers, thrown against walls,
against ships. They didn't explode like later grenades,
but they broke. They spread fire.
The principle was already there.
Contain, throw,
release energy abruptly. The name grenade would only emerge centuries later, inspired by a fruit, round,
full of seeds.
The resemblance was not aesthetic, it was symbolic.
When the casing broke, the contents spilled out, in all directions. At first, these weapons did not decide battles. They were a nuisance, and causing disruption was enough.
Ancient armies were formed in compact lines, shields together, bodies close together. A small explosion in the right place
would break the formation,
and a broken formation meant chaos. There was no specific training to deal with this. There was no doctrine.
There was improvisation. That's how a grenade is born.
Like a controlled accident, as an idea too dangerous to ignore. Whoever created it left no name.
Because nobody wanted to take the risk, but someone was always willing to launch it.
And each release taught something new.
Regarding distance.
About time.
About fear.
Long before it was standardized, the grenade had already fulfilled its initial purpose.
Introduce uncertainty. And in wars, uncertainty is a powerful weapon.
Time passed,
and the idea didn't disappear. She has matured.
The gunpowder became more stable, unreliable, but predictable enough.
Between the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the
modern era, the grenade ceased to be a rare curiosity.
It became an occasional tool.
Thachina military records show the most frequent use of hand pumps in sieges, wall defense,
narrow corridors. The enclosed space enhanced the effect.
The impact didn't just come from the explosion.
It came from the echo. An explosion inside a tower seemed bigger than it actually
was. In the Islamic world, artisans perfected ceramic vessels, thicker, but uniforms. Some survive to this day.
Fragments found in excavations.
They weren't pretty,
and they didn't need to be.
In Europe, contact with gunpowder intensified from the 14th century onwards, written out in full as required by the time and tradition. The cannons attracted attention, individual firearms as well.
But the grenade occupied an awkward space.
It wasn't a shot fired. It was launched.
It required strength. It required courage.
Whoever used it needed to get close. During sieges, this made a difference. High walls,
gates closed.
The grenade went through the windows.
It fell into inner courtyards, and it created panic.
It was in this context that specialized soldiers emerged.
Men chosen for their physique by the steady pulse. In France and other European kingdoms, these soldiers became known as grenadiers.
The name came from the function. It wasn't an honorable title at first. It was too dangerous. The grenadier was carrying extra weight.
I knew I was an easy target, but he also knew that his action could pave the way.
The grenades of that era had visible fuses. Short duration. Time was calculated by instinct, based on experience. Two are meant to die.
Therefore, its use was not constant.
It was selective.
The grenade did not replace existing weapons,
she added.
Its value was right at the right time.
In the right place. In open-pitched battles, it had little effect. In confined spaces, it was devastating. And so, silently, the grenade took root in military thinking.
Not as the protagonist, but only as a last resort. When nothing else worked,
She remained small.
discreet, but his reputation was growing because every soldier who saw her in action remembered the sound,
Do ECO.
from the confusion that followed.
The grenade didn't make a sound before it exploded, and that made all the difference.
As the centuries progressed,
The grenade ceased to be an improvised solution.
still dangerous, but less uncertain. In Europe, between the 16th and 17th centuries,
The battlefield began to change.
more disciplined training,
Clearer commands. The grenade has found a new space. Grenadiers came to exist as a recognized function.
there weren't many, and they didn't need to be.
They were carrying grenades strapped to their bodies, in thick bags, separated from the wick. The act of lighting and launching became a ritual, trained, repeated. Even so, the risk never disappeared.
Military reports speak of accidents,
From premature explosions, of fatal errors.
but they also talk about decisive effects.
During prolonged sieges, the grenade broke through invisible resistance. Moral.
Trust. Defenders heard the object fall.
They had seconds, and in those seconds, panic made the decisions.
Many were fleeing. Others threw themselves to the ground. Few reacted clearly.
The grenade did not kill en masse.
She was disorganized, and the disorganization opened doors. Armies like those often seen the Holy Roman Empire incorporated grenadiers into elite units, not because of the number of casualties caused, but because of the psychological effect. The mere presence of these soldiers altered the dynamics of
The combat.
They didn't always move forward, but as they moved forward, everyone noticed. The enemy recognized the hat.
Posture.
I knew what was coming next.
Over time,
The grenade began to lose ground to more efficient weapons.
in open fields, muskets have improved.
Artillery became more accurate. Still, she resisted, because wars don't only happen in open fields.
They happen in cities, in hallways, on stairs, and in those places, the grenade still spoke loudly. Interestingly,
Many grenadiers stopped using grenades frequently, but they kept the name,
the symbol, the weapon became an identity.
an echo of a time when few dared to light a fuse with the enemy just steps away.
The grenade then went through a period of silence,
It didn't disappear,
but he waited,
stored in arsenals, mentioned in textbooks,
hoping for a context that would restore its value.
because weapons don't just disappear.
They are sleeping, and the grenade still had a story to play. The return of the grenade has not been announced. There was no proclamation. She simply became useful again. When wars began to occupy cities more frequently, the logic changed.
Narrow streets,
Houses nearby.
low walls.
The fight became intimate. In this scenario, the grenade regained its original meaning.
Small object.
Big effect.
By the 18th century, it was no longer a novelty, but it wasn't obsolete either. Armies maintained it as a temporary resource for specific moments, forced entries, cleaning positions.
It wasn't glorious,
It didn't produce heroic paintings.
but it solved real problems.
Throughout successive European conflicts,
From the period of dynastic wars to the Napoleonic campaigns, the grenade appeared and disappeared as needed, never at the center of the strategy, always on the decisive edge.
she kept pace with the rhythm of the war.
When the fighting grew distant, she retreated. As she approached, she advanced.
That was its quiet impact, not in the number of deaths, but in altered behavior.
Soldiers learned to fear enclosed spaces. They learned to hesitate before venturing through doors and
Up staircases,
the grenade taught us caution, and caution changes battles. Over time, new materials emerged,
more durable casings,
more predictable explosives,
but the essence remained.
contain energy, to throw, break the momentum.
The grenade was never about brute force.
It was about interruption. Interrupt formations, interrupting decisions, interrupt your courage for a few seconds.
And a few seconds are all it takes. Throughout its ancient history, it never reigned alone,
He never decided entire wars.
but it was present at the critical points,
In places where maps are of no help,
where distance disappears.
its impact is not reflected in grand speeches.
It echoes in short stories,
Intense memories, an object thrown,
a dry sound,
a moment of chaos.
then silence again,
The grenade has survived for centuries in this way,
discreet,
feared.
and it left a clear lesson.
Not every weapon needs to be big to change history. Some just need to show up at the right time. Then the final echo remains. Not with a shout, not from a bugle.
but with a short snap.
The grenade never sought the spotlight. He never sought glory.
She accepted the invisible role.
While kings were remembered, while generals were signing treaties,
She acted in the corners.
in the shadows, the decisive seconds, he changed his pace. It broke impulses.
It created fear where there had previously been progress.
His power was never about size.
It was in that time,
At the exact moment when everything could change, and it turned around.
thus, silently,
The grenade traversed ancient and early modern history as
few weapons have managed to do. No monuments, no hymns,
but present.
because some forces don't dominate the world.
They divert him,
And this almost invisible deviation also writes history.
and then came the 19th century.
And with it came a rather cruel change. The war began to become industrial without asking permission, because it was no longer just courage, nor just discipline. It was a factory.
It was logistics,
It was an entire country learning to mass produce death.
like someone manufacturing nails. In this scenario, the grenade,
Doesn't disappear.
she fidgets.
It was as if he had been asleep for years and suddenly heard a noise at the door.
The cities were growing, the revolts too.
And the armies, becoming increasingly professional, began to face an old problem with a new face.
How do you get someone out of a protected place without having to go inside? And then the grenade makes sense again, just in a different guise.
On paper, it seemed simple, a better casing, a more reliable explosive, a system that didn't just rely on a fuse and prayer.
In practice, it took a while, because the wick had an inherent, almost psychological flaw,
He forced you to confront time. You light it,
and time becomes a living beast in your hand.
and during that period, for decades,
Somewhat convoluted solutions emerged. Grenades with strange mechanisms, models that worked sometimes, designs that disappeared.
after a bad test,
It's the kind of invention that nobody admits failed.
but nobody wants to repeat. But what doesn't wait for moral maturity?
So what started pushing the grenade back into the center wasn't glamour. It was necessary. Firearms evolved rapidly.
Rifles have become more accurate. And gradually, one thing became clear. If you manage to hit someone from a distance, you force everyone to take cover.
And when everyone hides,
The fight turns into a hunt. Hunting by angle, through a hole,
through the wall, a grenade is perfect for this.
because it doesn't negotiate with obstacles. She doesn't ask for line of sight. She doesn't need to see you. She just needs to go inside.
And then, at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, the grenade began to be reinvented with an almost obsessive goal: predictability. It was no longer acceptable to call it a controlled
Accident? Now it had to be a controlled accident. On a large scale.
for any soldier.
Not just for the brief grenadiers.
And ironically, this messes with the symbol.
Because when anyone can carry it, anyone becomes a potential thrower.
And then the fear spreads in a different way. Previously, you feared a specific type of soldier. Now, you fear the corner. And then came World War I. And with it, the place where the grenade finds its perfect habitat. The
Trench.
The trench is a setting that seems designed to humiliate the
Human mind. A narrow, muddy corridor with lingering smells.
horizon disappears. The sky becomes a low ceiling.
And out of nowhere, death arrives from above, from below, from the side, through sound.
In this environment, a rifle won't solve everything,
Because it has curves, it has cutouts, it has blind spots.
and any progress becomes a mere spectacle lasting only.
Seconds.
That's when the grenade stops being a supporting player,
It becomes a short phrase in a conversation that doesn't.
have time for a speech, and it appears in various forms.
Because countries start manufacturing however they can.
With what they have, some are more rounded and compact.
Others have a cable to provide range.
Some try to fragment themselves better,
Others prioritize concussion.
focusing more on shock than on spreading injuries.
But behind the design,
The prevailing effect is always the same: the interruption. In the trenches, the grenade doesn't have to defeat you,
she only needs to force you to step back half a meter.
and half a meter in a tight line becomes a domino effect. Fear returns faster than any piece of metal.
And there's a detail that few people talk about, but everyone feels. Unlike a gunshot,
A grenade has an almost personal quality to it, because the shot is from a distance. The shot is from over there. The grenade looks imposing. She went into her own space. It's invasive.
And at that time, an entire culture began to emerge around it. Not only the object, but the gesture, the reflex,
The instinct.
the soldier hears a faint sound, and the body decides before
The head. To descend. Cover. Run.
to scream or to freeze. And freezing up is the most terrifying thing, because that's when you realize you don't even have control.
Over your own body.
The First World War pushed the grenade into the definitive status of an environmental weapon.
It's not about open fields. It's about spaces that trap you. And the world was never the same again after that.
Because when a technology proves its worth on a large
Scale. It doesn't easily go back into the drawer. The grenade emerges from the mud of the trench and enters manual mode. And when it becomes part of the manual, it becomes routine. War routine is a word that even sends shivers down your
spine, because it seems contradictory, but it's real,
and the grenade, at this point,
is no longer an ancient legend. It's an inventory item,
but
it still retains that same original spirit, that somewhat absurd idea.
contain the fire within something small and trust that, at the right moment, it will obey. Obey, as if chaos had discipline. And this is the part that always comes back to haunt the story.
When you create a time-based weapon,
You create an anxiety-based weapon.
and anxiety has never been good at obeying.
When the First World War ends, the world struggles to breathe, but what remains is not peace.
It's a learning process.
And learning in war is rarely pretty. The armies look back and realize, okay, this works.
Then they start to standardize.
Creating models that anyone can use without becoming a martyr during training. And that's where grenades, which become iconic, come in. Not because they are glamorous, but because they are repeated until they become symbolic. Some develop grooves.
Almost as if the metal was designed to break just right.
Others have been made compact to fit better in the equipment. Others insist on using a cable because a cable provides leverage, reach, and that feeling of I can throw further. And here's something curious. The grenade begins to split into personalities.
There's one that's made for indoor spaces. There's one that's made for outdoor areas. There's one that's meant to create smoke and confuse vision. There's one that's for signaling. There's one that's for lighting. And that's almost ironic.
Because in the beginning, it wasn't meant to provide light or heat.
It was supposed to break.
Now, it also serves to control, without necessarily destroying.
And this changes the moral relationship with the object.
Because an artifact that was basically meant to be scare and disruption becomes a tool of indoctrination.
Procedural tool. And when it becomes a procedure, it becomes part of a language. World War II arrives and the scenario changes again.
Now it's all about mobility. Tank, city, home, debris, basements, steps, ruins. And the grenade, in this broken world, is almost an extension of urban combat.
It becomes the quickest way to manipulate what you can't
See,
and in urban areas, what you don't see is almost everything. But it also becomes a problem.
because urban warfare makes everything more mixed up.
Civilian, soldier, hallway, kitchen, bedroom.
All together, and that weighs heavily.
During this period,
The grenade became an object that carried two stories:
simultaneously,
the technical history, the efficiency, and the human story of guilt.
because when you throw something that explodes after a while, you're also throwing an irreversible decision.
And time, those seconds, seem like a twisted eternity.
The evolution of the mechanism throughout the 20th century attempts precisely to reduce improvisation, to reduce
Chance.
but it doesn't eliminate the essence.
You're still letting go of something that can't be recovered.
And then something happens that completely changes the
Mental game. The grenade enters popular culture. Cinema, book, photo, advertisement, report.
She becomes a symbol of courage, of action,
Of turning point. But that's somewhat misleading.
because, in real life, that's not heroism. She is calculation built upon fear, and fear doesn't like to be romanticized.
Over the decades,
The grenade has also become a tool for smaller operations.
localized conflicts, guerrilla warfare, occupations, and insurgencies. And that's where the uncomfortable part of the story comes.
When a weapon becomes simple enough to circulate easily,
It loses its symbolic control.
she leaves the army.
Turn the world around. And at this point, the grenade begins to resemble its origins again. An object that anyone can throw.
An accident that anyone can try to control. But now with more power, more resources, more substance.
from the second half of the 20th century onwards.
You also have the expansion of non-lethal or more
Controlled effect versions, used by police forces in certain contexts. Smoke dispersal.
flash noise.
Nevertheless, the psychological core remains the same. Interrupt behavior.
And this is much older than it seems. It's almost as if the grenade has always been a technology.
For emotional disruption, a physical way of saying stop. But the stop comes in the form of panic, and that's where the contradiction lies.
A tool created to break military formations ends up serving,
In various eras, as a tool to break human decisions, decision to move forward, the decision to resist, decision to stay, and this type of break is intimate.
though a grenade, in a way,
Is a weapon that speaks to the nervous system, not the ego. She transcends reason, and the 20th century,
full of wars that combine mass warfare and proximity, only reinforces this. With each conflict, she reappears with a new role, but with the same heart,
a tiny instant capable of turning an entire environment.
upside down.
And then the world enters the end of the century, the beginning of the 21st century, and the question that begins to haunt armies is not, does this work?
They already know it works.
The question becomes another one,
How to control the effect?
without losing the effect.
Because the grenade's effectiveness lies precisely in its unpredictability for the recipient, but the armies want predictability for those who use them.
This tug of war between control and chaos becomes the silent engine of evolution, and meanwhile, she remains what she's always been, a small object that forces the world to react. In the 21st century, the battlefield becomes strange, not because violence has become more modern, but because information has become faster than conflict.
Now it has a camera. It has satellites. There's video available right now.
Some was even become social media feeds, and the grenade, in this hyper-observed world, gains a new layer of weight.
It's too simple for a technology-filled environment, and that's precisely why it remains relevant. Because there are some things that technology cannot.
Replace
A closed door, a short corridor, a blind corner.
an upstairs area.
No matter how digital the world becomes,
The body still walks through hallways.
and the grenade, when it appears, still speaks the language of instinct. But along with that comes a growing obsession with reducing,
Collateral damage.
with better controlling the effect in mixed environments.
And then versions with different uses appear.
Some focused on creating a smokescreen, others on lighting.
Others on noise and glare to disorient for a few seconds. And those seconds remain the real currency.
It's almost bizarre.
An era that calculates everything with data still depends on
Moments of surprise. But there's a high emotional price to pay for this. Modernity. Because when everything is filmable, the psychological impact isn't limited to the battlefield.
They see the grenade becomes a symbol of chaos in a short video, and the symbol sticks. And this fuels a cycle.
Fear becomes a meme. The meme becomes propaganda.
The propaganda becomes justification, and the justification becomes more fear.
And the weapon,
Which has always been an interruption, also becomes a cultural trigger.
even when it's not used, it exists in people's minds.
And that's when the story starts to become paradoxical in a deeper way.
The more society tries to convince itself that it controls,
The world, the more it is haunted by objects that remind it.
that it doesn't. Because that's exactly what a grenade is. A reminder that time can turn against you in the blink of an eye. And perhaps that's why she never truly disappears. It's not just utilitarian.
It is symbolic.
She embodies the terror of too late.
And then, when you look back at the whole timeline, you can see a pattern that's almost human. Initially, the grenade was an experiment.
Then it became a tool. Then it became doctrine. Then it became culture.
Then he became a ghost. And the ghost is the hardest to fight.
Because it doesn't need to be present to give orders. The curious thing is that the grenade has endured for centuries without needing to win technological battles.
Such as greater range, greater precision, or greater power.
She won through a different method.
Because it fits in the hand.
Because it fits in your pocket, in your equipment, in your backpack, or when you improvise.
And above all, because it fits within fear. You can have an entire army with absurd technology, but if someone still needs to enter a building, climb stairs, or go through a door,
Then there's still room for that type of object.
war may change its clothes, but it doesn't change its architecture. And that's why, when we talk about grenades, We're not just talking about metal and explosives.
We're talking about human geometry, small spaces,
Limited movement.
automatic reactions, and perhaps that's the most uncomfortable part.
The grenade only works so well because humans are humans. We get scared. We retreat. People are being protected. It freezes people. And sometimes we blame ourselves afterwards. Because a grenade, more than many weapons,
Leaves a mental trace, not only for those who receive it,
but also for those who use it.
she doesn't have a comfortable shooting distance for.
Long-range shots. She has moral closeness. It has presence.
Even when you're meters away, the gesture is intimate. You launched something that entered someone's space,
And that weighs heavily on those who still have something.
alive inside them.
So,
When someone tries to summarize their grenade as just another weapon, they're always missing a layer.
the layer of the instant. The body layer. The layer of silence before.
Because, if you pay attention, the sound never comes like thunder. It comes like a dry snap.
And that snap is almost a cut from reality. Things aren't like they used to be.
And ultimately, perhaps that's what a grenade is.
A tool for transforming before into after without asking.
Permission.
No pretty warning.
No speech.
Just a snap.
It's a world that changes position for a few seconds,
And a few seconds.
are still enough to rewrite a lot of things. But there's a part of this story that almost no one wants to
Face head on.
A grenade is also a mirror, because it shows how much we, as a species, are passionate about shortcuts. We want to win without getting involved. They want to break up without talking.
He wants to pave the way without negotiating.
And I am not saying this in a moralistic tone, no. It's cooler than that. It's almost biological. Though a grenade is a brutal shortcut to solving a space problem. There's someone over there and I don't want to go there.
Ready. And that. And throughout the centuries, this impulse has only changed its setting.
Trench.
Ship. Wall. Home.
2.
Basement.
Ladder.
Always the same kind of fear.
The fear of what's hidden. And then you understand why the psychological effect has,
Always been greater than the physical one.
even as technology has become more powerful.
Because what it targets first is not the body. It's the control. It teaches you that you can be right and still miss the.
Crucial second.
And that's humiliating.
The whole story of the grenade is a back and forth between two desires,
The desire to master the chaos.
and the desire to use chaos as a weapon. And we pretend that this is strategy, but often it's just
Impulse dressed up in a uniform. And so the grenade traverses history almost like a short, cruel phrase that repeats itself in different eras.
if you can't convince them, interrupt.
But interrupting always has consequences, even when it doesn't appear in statistics.
Because the true legacy of the grenade isn't just what it does in the moment.
That's what she teaches the next generation. She teaches that some solutions are too quick, and solutions that are too quick can be addictive. An army learns this.
A group learns this. A society learns this, sometimes without realizing it.
And when you look at the modern world,
With fear spreading at high speed, you can feel a very ancient echo. Humanity still loves small objects with great power, because small objects give a dangerous sense of control. I load, I decide, I activate.
but ultimately, the grenade has always been the opposite of control.
It is the institutionalization of the unpredictable. We only call it a controller because we put a manual on top of it.
And perhaps that's why she continues to frighten people, even those who know her.
Because knowing doesn't neutralize instinct.
You can study, you can understand, you can reason it out. But in the moment, the body still responds to silence first. And the silence beforehand is what gives everything away.
It gives you time to imagine.
And imagination, when it's scared, is a factory of monsters.
So this story, from clay and ceramics, through walls, trenches,
Cities and videos was never really just about an artifact.
it was about how we deal with being close to others. Because, in the end, that's what war is. The other person exists.
And you decide whether to confront them or interrupt them. And the grenade is the interruption in the form of an.
Object. Now,
Think of an almost poetic detail, in the cruelest way possible. The name pomegranate comes from a fruit full of seeds, and when it breaks, it spills everywhere.
but over time, we stopped seeing the metaphor.
We were left with only the gesture.
And perhaps the strangest part is this.
The grenade doesn't scream.
She is not a threat on her own.
It only occupies space, and changes what that space means. And then, when the click happens,
The whole story becomes a point.
not a final point, a turning point.
And that's why, even after centuries, it still seems modern, because she doesn't depend on fashion. She is dependent on fear.
And fear, honestly, has never gone out of style. If you enjoyed this type of storytelling and want me to
continue with other weapons, tactics,
or historical moments in the same vein, follow and leave a like, so I know you want more.